I understand your request, but crafting a story with that level of detail and length is quite a challenge and can't be completed in one go due to the limits of this platform. However, I can still begin the story and develop it with the details and realism you're looking for. If you'd like, I can write a section now and we can keep expanding it over time. Here's the start of a scary hiking story based on a random scenario. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. I had been hiking for hours, the steady crunch of my boots on the gravel path echoing in the stillness of the woods. I hadn't seen a single soul for miles. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze, the chirp of distant birds, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. The trail was fairly well marked, winding through dense forest that seemed to swallow the light. I had done this hike a few times before, but this was the first time I had come alone. Something about it felt different today, though. Maybe it was the quiet or the way the air felt heavier, more oppressive. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I had taken a late start, deciding to tackle the hike in the late afternoon, hoping to reach a small clearing about 5 miles in, where I'd set up camp for the night. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized I was making slower progress than I'd anticipated. The path was steeper than usual, and the heavy growth of trees made it feel like the world was closing in around me. A little while later, I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle, my breath coming a little heavier than I expected. I scanned the trail behind me. The trees were so dense that I could barely see the path I'd already walked. My senses, normally sharp, felt dulled by the isolation. There was no noise, no movement. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, this was a remote area. I figured the animals had retreated into the deeper woods, away from human presence. I took another swig of water and pushed onward, focusing on the trail in front of me. The wind had died down, and the temperature was starting to drop. By now, the sun was close to dipping below the horizon, and I was starting to worry about finding my camp spot before darkness set in completely. The clearing I was aiming for was another mile or so ahead, but the trail had become harder to navigate. The path had narrowed, and the ground was uneven, with rocks and roots sticking up at odd angles. My legs were beginning to feel heavy, and I could sense the onset of fatigue. As I trudged along, a sudden movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, but then I saw it again, something darting between the trees, just out of sight. I froze. My heart began to pound in my chest, and my breath came a little quicker. It was no animal. It was too fast, too deliberate. It was like someone or something was watching me, staying just beyond the range of my sight. I told myself it was nothing, a deer maybe, or some other forest creature. I was alone in the woods, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the movement happened again. This time I was certain it was too deliberate to be an animal. Something or someone was tracking me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My instinct was to turn and walk away, to head back to where I had last seen a proper trail marker. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was getting closer. I couldn't hear any footsteps, no rustling of leaves, but the presence behind me seemed so palpable it was almost suffocating. I picked up the pace, my boots hitting the ground harder, my body now filled with a sense of urgency. The sound of my own breathing seemed deafening in the silence around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the woods were empty. Nothing but trees, shadows, and that strange, growing sense of being watched. I couldn't explain it, but it was there, like something was waiting, just out of sight, ready to pounce. My heart hammered in my chest as I pushed forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, my legs growing more and more tired, my body more and more desperate to get to safety. I told myself that I just needed to make it to the clearing, that I would be okay once I reached the open space. I could set up camp, make a fire, and everything would be fine. But the more I walked, the more the feeling of being followed intensified. It wasn't just a sensation anymore. I could hear faint footsteps behind me, a slight rustling of leaves, almost inaudible but unmistakable. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around and face whatever was following me, but I couldn't. The fear gripped me too tightly, forcing me to keep moving, to ignore the rational voice telling me to be calm. Suddenly, the trail took a sharp turn, and in the fading light, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just ahead of me. It was tall, silhouetted against the darkening sky. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker who had gotten lost like me, but something about it didn't sit right. I stopped dead in my tracks. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It was just standing there, perfectly still, like it was waiting for me. For a long moment, I couldn't do anything but stare. My pulse raced, and every instinct in my body screamed to run, to get away from whatever this was. But I was frozen. The figure was too strange, too unsettling. Then it moved. It wasn't the slow, hesitant movement of a person. It was too fluid, too unnatural. It took one long step forward, and I felt a chill sweep over me, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. In a blind panic, I turned and ran. I don't even remember thinking about it. My body just reacted. The sound of my heavy breathing was drowned out by the pounding of my feet against the ground, but I could still hear something behind me, closing the distance. The figure was following me. No, it wasn't just following, it was chasing me. I sprinted through the trees, my heart thundering in my chest, my legs burning with the effort. The trail had become a blur, my mind focused only on putting distance between myself and whatever that thing was. The sounds of footsteps grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one set of footsteps anymore. There were multiple. I could hear them all around me now, like the woods themselves were alive, watching me, waiting for me to fall. I didn't know how long I ran. The world around me seemed to distort, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare where the trees twisted and stretched in the wrong directions. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The footsteps, the presence, the chasing, it was all gone. I was standing in the middle of the trail, panting, my eyes darting nervously around. The woods were completely silent. I stood there for what felt like forever, too scared to move, my body locked in place by a mixture of exhaustion and sheer terror. My legs felt like jelly, but I couldn't take another step forward. I didn't know where I was anymore. The trail had disappeared, and all that remained was a thick, oppressive silence. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. Slowly, cautiously, I turned and made my way back. I didn't know where I was going or how far I'd run, but I just had to keep going. The clearing, the camp, it didn't matter anymore. I needed to get out of the woods, back to safety, back to something familiar. Eventually, I stumbled upon a familiar landmark, a large boulder covered in moss. I remembered passing it earlier. I had been heading the wrong way. My heart sank. I had been running in the wrong direction the entire time. It took everything in me to keep moving, but I managed to find my way back to the trailhead. By the time I emerged from the woods, the sun had set completely, and the night was pitch black. My hands were shaking, my mind still spinning from the terror I just experienced. I never found out what had been following me in those woods. I never saw that figure again, but I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted, of being just one step ahead of something that wanted me. The woods out there are beautiful, but they can also be dangerous in ways that you'll never fully understand until you're in the thick of it. And now, every time I go hiking, I'm always looking over my shoulder. The strange thing is, I haven't been back to that trail since. I'm not sure if I ever will. Hiking in Hawaii had always been a dream of mine. I'd heard countless stories about the stunning views, the lush jungles, and the rugged mountains that made up the landscape of the islands. What people didn't tell you was that hiking early in the morning, when the fog still clings to the trees, can make even the most seasoned hiker feel like they're in a completely different world. The kind of world where every rustle of the leaves feels like something you need to be wary of, and the stillness in the air makes your heart race even though there's nothing around. I had started my hike at first light, before the sun even had a chance to rise above the horizon. The air was thick with humidity, and the trees were dripping with moisture. I didn't mind the sweat, though. I was used to the conditions, and the climb was challenging in the best way possible. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, but the trees around me provided enough shade to keep things cool. I wasn't rushing. I just enjoyed the solitude. The birds hadn't fully woken up yet, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling in the underbrush or the soft thudding of my boots on the trail. I had been hiking for about an hour when my stomach gave a sudden, unmistakable warning. It wasn't a slow, gradual build-up. It was urgent. I could feel my insides twisting and knotting up, and it was clear that my body was telling me in no uncertain terms that it was time to go. Now, I knew from experience that hiking in remote areas meant that sometimes you had to be resourceful. It wasn't the first time I'd found myself needing to take care of business on the trail, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. However, I wasn't exactly keen on the idea of squatting in the middle of the jungle, hoping no wild animals were nearby or that no one would happen to stumble upon me at the wrong moment. I had heard that there were bathrooms closer to the trailhead, and I was about to find out if that was true. I quickened my pace, hoping that I could make it. The only thought running through my head was that I didn't want to be stuck in the middle of nowhere with no option other than the great outdoors. After about 20 more minutes of hiking, I spotted what I was looking for. A small building with a few porta-potties sitting next to it, tucked off the side of the trail, just like I remembered from my research. The sight of it was like seeing an oasis after miles of nothing but trees and rocks. I wasted no time in heading over and practically sprinted toward the nearest one. When I opened the door, the smell hit me immediately, but I didn't care. I was just grateful to be somewhere safe and private. I quickly got inside and locked the door behind me, my body already feeling the relief as I sat down. After I finished my business, I grabbed for the toilet paper, flipping on my headlamp to make sure I could find it. The dim light bounced around the small, cramped space, casting shadows on the walls. I was about to grab the roll when I saw something that made my heart freeze for a moment. In the far corner of the porta-potty, hanging from one of the wooden beams, was a massive spider. It was huge, easily 5 inches in diameter, with long, spindly legs that looked like they could wrap around my wrist. Its body was a dark, mottled brown with faint patterns running down its back. It was just sitting there, hanging perfectly still, as if it had every right to be in there with me. For a second, I just froze, staring at it. I wasn't afraid of spiders, at least not the small ones, but this was different. This was something that could potentially end my life if it felt threatened. I knew the stories about Hawaiian spiders, how some could be deadly, how they liked to stay hidden in places where they weren't disturbed. I didn't want to make a sudden move and provoke it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. My goal was simple: get the toilet paper, finish what I had to do, and get out of there without causing a scene. But, of course, nothing ever goes according to plan when you're dealing with wildlife. I slowly reached for the one-ply toilet paper, trying to stay as calm as possible. My headlamp beam followed my hand, and that's when I made the mistake of shining the light directly on the spider. That was when everything went to hell. The moment the light hit it, the spider exploded into frantic motion. It began darting back and forth across the corner of the porta-potty, its legs skittering frantically over the walls. I could hear its tiny feet scraping against the plastic, and my brain couldn't process what was happening. I watched, frozen, as the spider ran in circles, moving faster than I ever would have thought possible. And then, without warning, the spider did something that made my blood run cold. It suddenly changed direction and started charging toward me. I wasn't sure if it was a reflex or if the spider had decided it was now the predator, but the terror hit me like a punch to the gut. I was stuck in the tiny space, trying not to scream or panic as the spider came closer, moving right across the floor and up the wall toward me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't jump out of the way. I was in a freaking porta-potty, for God's sake, and my pants were already halfway down. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I wiggled. I shifted side to side, my feet trying to get some leverage, but nothing was working. The spider, with its terrifying speed, was getting closer, and I could feel my pulse racing. My mind screamed at me to get out of there, but my body was frozen. I wasn't sure if I was scared of the spider or more terrified of the fact that I couldn't do anything to stop it from getting closer. But then it did the one thing that completely sent me over the edge. The spider, this freaking monster, suddenly ran right between my legs, inside of my underwear. I almost lost it completely. In that moment, all rational thought left me. The sheer panic of having a giant spider crawling up between my legs, knowing it could bite me at any second, was enough to make me snap. I jerked my body to the side, hoping to shake the spider off, but it didn't work. It didn't budge. Instead, the spider seemed to ignore my attempts and crawled up my leg, its legs sending shivers up my spine. I wasn't thinking anymore. I wasn't processing the situation. I was just reacting. I screamed. I shouted in panic, and the terror that washed over me was like nothing I had ever experienced before. It wasn't about the spider anymore. It was about the fact that I had lost control of the situation, and the helplessness consumed me. I yanked open the door of the porta potty, my pants still halfway down, and ran out of there as fast as I could. I wasn't sure if I was still screaming or if I had lost the ability to make noise, but I know I bolted. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to get as far away from that spider as humanly possible. I don't know what happened to that spider. Maybe it ran off into the forest. Maybe it was still hiding in the corner of the porta potty. But I didn't look back to check. All I knew was that the moment I stepped away from the porta potty, I had lost every ounce of dignity I had left. I was standing in the middle of the jungle, pants around my ankles, heart racing, covered in sweat and dirt, with no real idea of how I had gotten myself into that situation. I walked back to the trailhead with my pants still hanging around my knees, trying to act like nothing had happened. But I knew the real story, and as much as I tried to laugh it off later, I knew that moment would stick with me for the rest of my life. Somewhere out there in the woods, that spider was probably still laughing at me. I had been hiking in the mountains for a couple of hours when the day took a turn that would stick with me forever. It wasn't the first time I'd been in the wilderness, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but something about that particular hike felt different. I had ventured out on my own, as I often did, preferring the solitude of the trails to the noise of civilization. It was mid-afternoon, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze rustling through the trees. The trail I was following wound its way through dense forest, up and down small hills, and past streams that bubbled through the rocks. I didn't have a particular destination in mind. I'd just been exploring, enjoying the quiet and the challenge of the uneven terrain. The trail was well maintained, so I didn't have to worry too much about losing my way. But I knew that if I kept going long enough, I'd eventually get far enough from the trailhead that I would be fully on my own. I didn't mind that at all. I liked the idea of being completely alone. No one around for miles, no one to disturb the peace of the wilderness. As I continued on, I started to notice that the woods were getting quieter. I hadn't seen many animals so far, just a few birds flitting through the trees and the occasional squirrel darting across the path. But now everything seemed still, unnervingly still. It wasn't the usual quiet of the forest, the kind that makes you feel connected to the place. It was different, a kind of silence that almost felt unnatural. I paused for a moment, standing still in the middle of the trail, scanning the area around me. The wind had died down, and there wasn't a sound to be heard except for the soft rustling of leaves underfoot as I shifted my weight. It was then that I saw it. At first, it didn't register. It was just a flash of movement in the brush, something I thought I'd imagined. But then I saw it again, clearer this time, just at the edge of the clearing. A large, tan shape moving slowly and deliberately through the underbrush. I froze. I didn't know what it was at first, but the shape, the movement, felt too deliberate to be an animal I was used to seeing, too large, too purposeful. It wasn't until I caught a glimpse of its head, the unmistakable shape of a mountain lion, that I realized what I was looking at. I had been in the woods enough to know what that looked like. I've seen mountain lions before, from a distance, mostly as they dart off into the trees the moment they hear or see me. They're elusive creatures, mostly staying hidden and only showing themselves when they want to, when they feel secure. And this one was no different. It had clearly noticed me, but it wasn't acting like it was scared. It wasn't running off the way most animals would. I stood completely still, heart hammering in my chest, unsure of what to do. It was a strange mix of awe and terror. Here I was, staring at one of the most powerful predators in North America, in its element, completely at ease in a way I could never be. The lion didn't seem to notice me at first. Its focus was entirely on the ground in front of it. And then I saw it. Lying in front of the lion was a deer, dead or nearly so, its legs awkwardly splayed out, eyes still open in shock, a pool of blood slowly spreading around its body. The lion, standing just a few feet from the carcass, was clearly getting ready to feast. It had a look of intent in its eyes, completely unaware of my presence. I wasn't sure what to do. I knew that mountain lions don't usually attack humans, but it still felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I had no business witnessing. I didn't make a sound, didn't move, but in some way, I felt like the lion knew I was there. Something about its stillness, its focus on the deer, made me feel like I was being sized up. The tension in the air was palpable. I had heard before that if a mountain lion wanted to attack, it would move so fast and silently that you'd never see it coming. But here I was, witnessing it preparing to pounce, and yet the creature wasn't moving in any way that suggested aggression toward me. I wanted to step back, but I couldn't bring myself to move. There was a part of me that was fascinated by the scene in front of me, as disturbing as it was. It wasn't every day that you saw a wild predator in action, especially not one in such close proximity. I had read about mountain lions in textbooks, heard stories, but to witness it firsthand, it was something else entirely. And then, almost as if in slow motion, the lion's head lifted, and it turned to look directly at me. I don't know what passed between us in that moment. I wasn't close enough for it to consider me a threat, but it had definitely noticed me. Its eyes locked on mine for a few seconds, an almost eerie stillness between us. It didn't snarl or make a sound. It simply stood there, watching me, its body tense, poised to move at any moment. I felt my heart stop in my chest. Then, without warning, it moved. It wasn't the kind of movement you'd expect from an animal of its size. There was no growl, no sudden shift in posture, no rustling of leaves as it bolted. It was completely silent. The lion didn't even seem to make a noise as it turned and began to retreat into the forest. The way it moved, graceful and quick, was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't a typical run either. It was almost like it was melting into the woods, disappearing into the trees without a sound. No crunch of leaves, no snapping of twigs, nothing. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing. What had just happened? The moment had been so surreal, it felt like something out of a dream. I was used to hearing animals move in the forest, twigs breaking, leaves rustling. But that lion, it had moved like it was invisible, like a ghost. For a while, I didn't know what to do. I stayed where I was, unsure of whether I should follow the trail back to safety or stay put and wait. I had no idea where the lion had gone or how close it still was. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and unsure of my next move. After a few minutes of standing still, I decided to slowly backtrack, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. The silence of the forest seemed even more pronounced now, the air heavier, the space around me more foreboding than before. I was hyper-aware of every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig. I knew the lion was out there somewhere, but where? How close was it? The way it had disappeared into the forest without a sound still bothered me. The idea that it could be moving around me, watching me, and I wouldn't know until it was too late, that was the scariest part. I knew that mountain lions were experts at stalking prey, but in that moment I felt like prey too. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't in control anymore, that I was a part of something I didn't fully understand. The wilderness had always been beautiful to me, but now it felt hostile. The silence that had once calmed me now seemed suffocating. I made it back to the trailhead without incident, but the memory of the lion's gaze stayed with me long after. The way it had just vanished into the forest, without a sound, haunted me. It was like I had stepped into the lion's world for a moment, one where I was the intruder and the lion was the master. It wasn't until I got home and started thinking about the encounter that I fully understood what had happened. That lion had been preparing to eat, its mind on the hunt. But when it saw me, it made a decision. It didn't feel threatened enough to attack, but it wasn't going to let me interrupt its meal either. And it had made its escape with such quiet efficiency, as though it knew it had nothing to fear from me. The scariest part wasn't the lion itself, but how effortlessly it had moved in and out of the situation, without a single sound, without a single sign that it was even there. I had no answers for what had happened that day, and maybe that's what bothered me most of all. I didn't know what the lion had been thinking, what it would have done if it hadn't seen me, or if it had been closer when it decided to retreat. I didn't know what might have happened if I hadn't spooked it. And that uncertainty, the realization that there are creatures in this world that are just as much a part of the landscape as the trees and rocks, is what stuck with me the most. I still hike, still explore the mountains, but I carry that experience with me, like a shadow, every time I venture into the wilderness. The mountains are beautiful, yes, but they are also wild, and in the silence of the forest, there are things that move without a sound, things that are always watching, always waiting. I had been planning this hiking trip for weeks. The mountains had always called to me, their towering peaks a constant temptation that I could never quite shake. I'd hiked through a lot of rugged terrain before, but this time, I wanted something different, something more remote, a trail that most people didn't take, a path less traveled. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Peace, solitude, maybe a little adventure, but I knew I was craving something deeper than just another weekend hike. The trail I picked was in the Cascade Mountains, a place that was as beautiful as it was daunting. It had a reputation for being rough, with little foot traffic and fewer people than most popular trails. That's what appealed to me most. I wanted the isolation, the silence, the challenge of tackling something that wasn't a tourist attraction. Just me, the trail, and whatever wilderness lay ahead. I was used to hiking alone, finding comfort in the quiet of the forest, so I didn't think twice when I decided to take on this particular route by myself. I packed my gear carefully the night before, knowing the hike would be tough. The weather was unpredictable, and there was a chance of rain, so I made sure to bring waterproof gear and a sturdy tent. I had my food and water sorted, a good pair of boots, a map, and my trusty compass, just in case. I left the trailhead early in the morning, the air crisp and cool, the sky overcast with clouds that hung low over the treeline. The first few hours were beautiful. The trail was challenging, winding its way up through thick forests of cedar and pine, the ground soft with moss and damp leaves. It was the kind of trail where the only sounds you could hear were your own footsteps and the occasional rustle of a small animal darting through the underbrush. I loved it. There was something soothing about being alone in a place like that, the quiet wrapping around you like a blanket, muffling everything except the natural world. As I pushed deeper into the mountains, I started to notice fewer signs of civilization. No more trail markers, no more well-maintained paths. The trail grew rougher, more overgrown. It was obvious that not many people ventured this far. The trees grew denser, their branches thick and dark, and the ground underfoot turned uneven and slippery. I didn't mind. This was exactly what I was looking for, a challenge. By mid-afternoon, the sky started to turn darker. I could feel a storm brewing in the air. The clouds were thickening, and the temperature dropped a few degrees. I decided to make camp early. There was a small clearing ahead, and I figured I could set up my tent and prepare before the rain hit. I found a decent spot, level ground with a little protection from the trees. I gathered some dry wood for the fire and started setting up. The rain was still a ways off, but I didn't want to be caught outside when it started coming down. I finished setting up my camp and was about to light the fire when I heard something, a sound I couldn't quite place. It wasn't like the usual forest noises, no squirrels, no birds. This sound was heavier, slower, and it seemed like it was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I paused, standing still, trying to listen. The air felt thick, almost too still. Then, the sound came again, louder this time. It was a crunching noise, like something heavy walking on the forest floor. I wasn't sure what to make of it. At first, I thought it might be a bear or some other large animal, but the sound wasn't quite right for that. Bears are usually more cautious, shuffling through the forest without making much noise. This sound was deliberate, as if whatever was making it knew exactly where it was stepping. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously moved toward the edge of the clearing, trying to peer into the dark woods beyond. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense, making it hard to see much past a few feet. I stood there for a while, the crunching sound gradually fading as I waited, listening intently. It was then that I realized how quiet the rest of the forest had become. The birds had stopped calling. There was no more wind, no more rustling. Felt wrong. I decided to stay put for a while, figuring it was probably just an animal moving through. But the feeling of unease crept over me. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I was being watched. There was no logical reason for it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't feel safe. As I sat down to try to calm myself, I realized I hadn't seen any sign of other hikers on this trail. The only signs of life I had encountered were animals, and even those were few and far between. I had passed an old signpost a couple of miles back, the paint peeling off and the words barely legible. That was it. No other people, just me and the wilderness, and whatever was out there in the trees. The storm finally hit just as I was about to settle into my tent. The first few drops of rain were heavy, quickly turning into a downpour. I zipped up the tent, crawled inside, and tried to ignore the gnawing sense of discomfort that still hadn't left me. The sound of rain on the tent was loud, almost deafening, but it did little to soothe my nerves. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept racing, thinking about the noises I had heard, the feeling of being watched, the oppressive silence of the forest. What was out there? What had I heard? Was it just my imagination running wild? I didn't know, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my tent. Soft, deliberate steps, slow but steady. My heart leapt into my throat as I lay there, completely still, listening. The footsteps circled the tent, moving slowly around it. I couldn't tell how many there were, but I could hear them clearly, like someone was pacing around, just outside the reach of my flashlight. I stayed frozen, not daring to move. My breathing was shallow, every muscle in my body tense, as if I might snap at any moment. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity. They weren't loud, but they were steady, methodical. Whoever or whatever was out there was taking its time. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal, another hiker, someone else who had gotten lost. But none of those seemed to make sense. No animal moves that carefully around a campsite. No hiker would pace around someone's tent for that long in the middle of a storm. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited for a long time, unable to bring myself to move. I was terrified, my mind in overdrive, replaying everything that had happened, trying to find some logical explanation. But nothing made sense. After what seemed like hours, I finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent door and peek outside. I shined the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the rain and the darkness. There was nothing, no sign of any footprints, no movement in the trees, just the sound of rain falling heavily on the ground. I didn't feel safe anymore. My gut told me to leave, to get out of there as fast as I could. But the storm was only getting worse, and the trail was likely too dangerous to hike in the dark. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stayed in my tent, wide awake, listening to the storm rage outside, hoping whatever had been out there wouldn't return. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the sun was just starting to peek through the clouds. I packed up my camp quickly, not bothering to make breakfast, and started the long hike back to the trailhead. The woods were silent, and the world felt unnervingly empty, as though whatever had been out there was still watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I didn't look back as I got into my car and drove away. The silence of the wilderness still lingered in my mind, a constant reminder that there are things out there that we don't understand. Things that move in the shadows, watching, waiting. I don't know what it was that night or what I heard, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to those mountains anytime soon. The wilderness might be beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. And sometimes, it's better not to know what's lurking in the dark. It was one of those perfect early autumn days in Vermont, the kind where the air has just enough chill to it to make you appreciate a warm jacket. But the sun still had a lot of heat to offer. I was on the tail end of a solo hike that I'd been planning for weeks, taking my time as I wandered through the dense forest. I love hiking in Vermont. It's quiet, peaceful, and the landscape is always breathtaking. The trails wind through thick woods, past old stone walls, and through small streams that seem to run forever. I had been on the trail for a few hours already when I came across something strange. At first, it seemed like just another oddity that hikers occasionally encounter on long walks. Something to investigate, maybe snap a picture of and move on from. But as I drew closer, I began to feel uneasy, though I couldn't explain exactly why. Maybe it was because I was out there alone with no one else around for miles. Or maybe it was the fact that what I was about to find didn't belong in the woods at all. About 100 feet off the trail, nestled between a few trees, I saw something out of place. A bright red shirt hanging from a low branch. It looked odd, almost too vibrant against the backdrop of the green foliage. At first, I thought it was someone's lost gear. I remember thinking it was strange for someone to have left it hanging there, but people can be careless on the trail, so I wasn't too concerned. I walked over to take a closer look, and as I did, I noticed something else just beyond the shirt. A small clearing in the trees. My curiosity got the better of me, so I moved further in, stepping carefully to avoid tripping on roots or hidden rocks. I was getting deeper into the woods now, far enough that I couldn't hear the sounds of the main trail anymore. All I could hear was the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. As I got closer, the red shirt became even more bizarre. It wasn't just hanging casually. It was carefully placed on the branch, like someone had draped it there for a reason. At that moment, I felt the first inkling of something being wrong. It wasn't just the shirt. There was something about the way it was positioned, the fact that it seemed too intentional. I looked around, and that's when I noticed the dirt. There were freshly dug patches of earth scattered around the clearing. The soil was loose, not yet fully settled, and it looked like it had been recently disturbed. My heart rate quickened, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I crouched down and took a closer look. It wasn't just a few stray patches of dirt. It was a pattern, like someone had been digging here for a while. The ground looked uneven, and in the center of the small clearing, I saw what appeared to be a few large, weathered stones. At first, I thought they were just rocks that had been scattered, but as I walked closer, I realized they were headstones. Old ones, the kind you usually see in old cemeteries, weather-beaten and covered in moss. But this wasn't a cemetery. This wasn't even a place where people should be buried. I took a step back, my mind racing. These were headstones that didn't belong here. They looked too old to be recent, but there were multiple markers, enough to indicate that this wasn't some random occurrence. Someone had moved them here, placed them carefully in this clearing, far from any established graveyard. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The implications of what I was seeing started to settle in, but I couldn't wrap my head around it fully. I scanned the area again. There were no bodies, no obvious signs of any human remains, but the headstones, those old, weathered markers, were enough. There were at least 4 of them, each marking what seemed to be a resting place, though no one had been laid to rest here in a long time. The realization slowly dawned on me that this wasn't some kind of forgotten burial ground. This was something else, something far darker. The stones were not meant to be here. I felt my stomach tighten as I looked around the clearing, the unsettling thought growing stronger in my mind. The graves weren't the only thing out of place. I noticed the ground near the trees was also disturbed, almost like something had been dragged across it. But it wasn't just dragged. It was like someone had carefully moved things, rearranged them as if setting up a ritual. The whole scene was wrong. At that moment, I knew I couldn't stay out there any longer. My instincts screamed at me to get out of the clearing, back onto the main trail. I turned, ready to leave, but then something stopped me. There was a noise behind me. It was faint at first, just the rustling of leaves, but it was followed by the sound of something heavier, footsteps, soft but deliberate. My heart raced again, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But no, the sound was real. Someone or something was out there. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I bolted, stumbling over roots and rocks, not daring to look back. The panic surged through me, driving me forward. I had to get out of that place. The thought of whoever or whatever had moved those headstones, the idea that someone had been digging here in the middle of the woods, sent my pulse into overdrive. I reached the main trail, gasping for air, my legs shaking as I tried to regain my composure. I didn't stop until I made it to a nearby ranger station. I had to tell someone. I didn't know who would believe me or if anyone would even care, but I knew I had seen something that wasn't right, something dangerous. The ranger listened intently, his expression hard to read, but when I mentioned the headstones and the disturbed graves, his face shifted. "We've had reports recently," he said, his voice low, "of people taking grave markers. It's been happening in this area for a while now. People taking headstones and sometimes even disturbing the graves, trying to take the bodies for God knows what." My blood ran cold as I realized how right I had been. I hadn't been imagining things. Someone had been stealing the headstones, moving them to the woods for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. As for the bodies, the thought of someone digging up graves and taking what lay beneath them was too horrifying to think about. The ranger promised to send someone out to investigate, but part of me knew they wouldn't find anything. The graves were too well hidden, and anyone involved in the grave robbing scheme would be long gone by now, blending into the forest like shadows. Still, I reported what I had seen, and that was all I could do. The following weeks felt like a blur. The trail I had walked so many times before now seemed darker to me, haunted by the memory of the graves I'd found. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone with a sinister purpose, had been walking in those woods long before I had. I still don't know the full extent of what was happening out there. I never found out if they were taking bodies too, or if it was just the headstones they wanted. But every time I think back to that day, to the strange red shirt and the freshly dug graves, I feel a cold weight in my chest. The woods had always been a place of solace for me, a place where I could find peace and solitude. But after that experience, I couldn't help but wonder how many other dark secrets the forest held. Secrets buried beneath the trees, waiting to be uncovered by someone else. The Sierra Nevada is one of those places you go to for a challenge, a place where the trails stretch on for miles, climbing up steep slopes, winding through thick pines, and testing your limits. I had hiked it before, but this time I was with a group of 15 people. Friends, acquaintances, and a few people I hadn't met before. The goal was simple: spend a week on the trail, push ourselves, and enjoy the kind of solitude only the mountains can provide. We started the hike on a crisp morning, the kind where the air is just cold enough to be refreshing but not unbearable. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees, and the path was smooth, winding up and down as it took us further from civilization. Our backpacks were heavy with supplies, but the camaraderie of the group made the weight bearable. The excitement of the trail was palpable. Everyone was eager to get deeper into the wilderness, away from the noise of city life. The first few days were smooth. We'd hike in the morning, set up camp in the afternoon, and spend our evenings around a campfire, talking and sharing stories. But, like all good plans, there was something lurking just out of sight, something that would turn everything upside down on the third night. That day on the trail was an easy one. We walked through towering pine forests and crossed small streams that tumbled over rocks. It was beautiful, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, no wind, and warm enough to keep our jackets tied around our waists. Everyone was in high spirits, but it was also a quiet kind of energy. The kind of calm that comes when you've been hiking all day, when your legs are sore and you've settled into the rhythm of the trail. When we reached camp that evening, we found a nice spot near a large clearing. It was surrounded by dense trees, providing some shelter from the wind. The ground was soft but firm, and the flat space made setting up tents easy. As we unloaded our gear and started setting up camp, I noticed a few bears were mentioned among the warnings at the trailhead before we'd set off. Make sure your food is properly stored. Bears are active in this area, it said. It was something we all took seriously. Most of us had experience with bears on the trail, how they can get into anything if given the chance, even something as simple as a plastic bag. We all made sure our food was in bear-proof containers, and the group leader mentioned the importance of hanging any food in trees, as the area was known to have black bears. But not everyone took it as seriously as they should have. My friend David had just eaten a banana earlier in the day. We were all snacking on trail mix or energy bars, but David had this habit of eating a banana whenever we stopped. He said it was the best natural energy boost. I'd watched him finish the fruit as we walked along, and as always, he didn't want to litter. He was that kind of person, always mindful of the environment. So, without thinking much of it, he slipped the banana peel into one of the side pockets of his jacket. We all knew that bears have a crazy sense of smell. They can pick up scents from miles away, especially when it comes to food. It was something we'd been reminded of multiple times. But David, wrapped up in the excitement of the trail and the small tasks of setting up camp, didn't give it a second thought. He zipped up his jacket and we all moved on, busying ourselves with gathering firewood, setting up our tents, and getting dinner ready. The night came quickly. The campfire crackled as we sat around it, the warm glow casting dancing shadows on our faces. The stories flowed freely, with everyone sharing something funny, a bit of wisdom from the trail, or just the usual banter that comes when a group is comfortable with each other. I could feel the fatigue from the long hike settling in, and my eyelids were heavy, the pull of sleep tugging at me. By the time the fire had died down to embers, people were heading to their tents, one by one. I fell asleep quickly, the sound of the forest around me lulling me into a deep, quiet sleep. It was one of those nights where the stars seemed to stretch on forever, and the world outside my tent felt so far away. That's how it was when you camped out here. The nights were deep, and the silence felt infinite. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, my eyes snapping open. It wasn't the usual rustling of the trees or the occasional hoot of an owl that stirred me. It was something else, something closer. I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat, a low growl, a deep rumbling noise. For a split second, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe a dream was still lingering at the edges of my mind. But then the growl came again, much closer this time. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I could hear the sounds of movement, heavy steps on the ground, crunching leaves and twigs underfoot. I could hear someone in the camp waking up, followed by frantic whispers, and then more growls closer still. The tension in the air was palpable, like the entire camp was holding its breath. I zipped open my tent and stepped out into the cool night air, my feet bare on the damp ground. The fire was long gone, and the moonlight painted everything in shades of gray. In the distance, I saw the outlines of the other tents, still dark and unmoving. But just past them, I could see a large, hulking figure moving between the trees. The bear. It wasn't just one bear either. There were at least 2, maybe 3, moving through the camp like they owned it. The sounds of panic rose from the group. People were shouting, waking up, scrambling in their tents. But the bears weren't immediately aggressive. They weren't charging or attacking. They were sniffing around, moving carefully through the camp, attracted to something. And that's when it hit me, the banana peel. David had left it in his jacket pocket. It wasn't food in the usual sense, but it was enough to draw them in, enough for them to be curious. I could hear the bears sniffing around, their noses flaring as they searched for the source of the smell. It wasn't life-threatening, not yet, but it was terrifying. We had made the mistake, and now the bears were in our camp, sniffing, wandering, drawn by the smallest of scents. People were yelling now. Some of them were already out of their tents, throwing things, rocks, sticks, anything they could find to try and scare the bears away. I grabbed a stick from the ground, and others began banging pots together, shouting, trying to make noise to drive them off. It felt like hours, though it was only minutes. The bears seemed confused at first, unsure of what to do with all the noise. They growled again, their massive bodies shifting between the trees. They were close, too close. I could feel the ground vibrating with their weight as they moved. My heart raced, but we kept making noise, yelling and banging, trying to make ourselves seem bigger, more threatening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bears turned away, slowly retreating into the trees. They were more curious than anything, not hungry or aggressive, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. The group stood in shock, some of us shaking, trying to catch our breath. David was pale, his face a mix of confusion and fear, realizing just what had happened. He hadn't thought about the banana peel. It wasn't a huge mistake in the grand scheme of things, but it had been enough to draw the bears in. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. Everyone was too on edge, and it felt like a miracle that nothing more serious had happened. In the morning, we packed up quickly, no one lingering to enjoy the sunrise. We made sure to properly store our food, keeping everything in bear-proof containers and hanging anything aromatic far out of reach. As we continued on our hike that day, we moved a little faster, the urgency in our steps matching the lessons learned the night before. We'd come out there for adventure, for nature. But that night had been a sharp reminder. Out there, nature can turn on you in an instant, and even the smallest mistake can have big consequences. By the time we left the mountains, we all knew one thing for sure. Bears don't forget the smell of food, and neither should you. The Sierra Mountains in California are nothing like the trails you find back home. This place felt raw, untamed, and massive. We had been talking about a backpacking trip here for months, ever since the winter snow had finally melted away. I've been hiking before, but nothing like this. The air was thin, the forest dense with towering pines, and the silence around us felt almost unnatural, like the mountains were holding their breath. There were 4 of us on the trip, me, my buddy Tom, and 2 other guys, Greg and Aaron. We were all seasoned hikers, but this time we wanted to push ourselves farther. We set out to cover as much ground as we could, going deeper into the wilderness. The plan was to make camp each night, hike a little more during the day, and keep moving. But that night, things didn't go according to plan. We had been on the trail for a few days, enjoying the isolation, the challenge of the climbs, and the way the wilderness seemed to wrap itself around us. Everything was fine up until that point. We set up camp in a small clearing just off the main trail, a secluded spot, perfect for a peaceful night under the stars. Everyone was in good spirits, tired but content, and we set up our tents quickly as the sun dipped low behind the peaks. We made a fire, cooked our meals, and sat around, just talking and taking in the sounds of the forest. The rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance, and the hum of insects filled the night. After we ate, we were all tired from the day's hike, so we went to bed, each of us crawling into our tents to get some rest. But there was one rule we all followed, one that was drilled into us by every guidebook and ranger we met along the way. Keep your food and anything with a scent in a bear bag. Bears are known to be attracted to anything that smells like food. This includes things like toothpaste, deodorant, even soap. Simple. If you have food or anything aromatic, it goes in the bear bag and gets hung up high in a tree, out of reach, away from your tent. Tom, for some reason, had completely forgotten about that. He was tired, just like the rest of us, and he made a rookie mistake. He had left his toothpaste sitting in the corner of his tent. It wasn't something I realized until we were already in our tents, zipped up for the night. Tom's tent was just a few feet away from mine, maybe 10 feet at most. The wind had calmed, and the night was still. It was one of those moments when you lie there, eyes wide open, and the quiet feels heavier than usual. Then I heard it, a faint, low growl that sent a chill down my spine. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before, too deep, too guttural. I lay still for a second, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind, or maybe a distant animal in the woods. But then I heard it again, closer, louder. The growl was unmistakable. My heart started racing. I wasn't sure if the others had heard it, but I wasn't about to wait to find out. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and unzipped the tent. The first thing I saw was Tom's tent shaking, the fabric rippling like there was something moving inside. Then I heard his voice, clear and panicked. "Guys, help, get off me." His words were muffled, frantic, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. I shot out of the tent without thinking, flashlight in hand, looking around in the darkness. My eyes couldn't make sense of the shapes around me, the shadows of the trees standing like black sentinels in the moonlight. But what caught my attention wasn't just Tom's voice. It was the shape in the dark, a massive shadow just outside his tent. A bear. A huge black bear was right on top of him, its front paws pushing down on the fabric of the tent as it tried to rip its way in. I froze for a second, adrenaline flooding my system. There was no mistaking it. The bear was looking for food, and Tom's toothpaste was the prize. I could hear the bear's claws scraping against the ground, its heavy breathing and sniffs as it tried to get closer to Tom's tent. The tent shook again, and I could hear Tom yelling in terror, his voice muffled by the canvas walls. I didn't have time to think. My first instinct was to get to him, but I knew I wasn't equipped for that. I was no match for a bear, especially not one that had already decided it was going to get what it wanted. I spun around, running to the other guys' tents. I could hear Aaron and Greg moving inside, getting out, probably just as shocked and scared as I was. We didn't have much time. We needed to get that bear off him. "Grab the pots. Anything loud," Greg shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the nearest pot and a big rock, something to make noise. We needed to make ourselves as big and scary as possible. I looked back at Tom's tent just in time to see the bear swipe at the fabric, its claws raking through the thin material. Tom was shouting, trying to fight the bear off, but he was trapped inside. "Tom!" I yelled, my voice shaking, but I wasn't sure if he heard me. My mind was racing. What if we couldn't get the bear to leave? What if it got worse? "Now! On 3, 1, 2, 3, Aaron shouted, and we all started banging the pots together, shouting, throwing rocks toward the bear. The noise was deafening. My hands shook as I pounded the pan, and I could feel my throat tighten with panic. The bear didn't move. It just kept trying to get inside Tom's tent, its massive body blocking the way. Then, as if it realized we were serious, the bear let out a growl so loud it shook the ground beneath us. It looked toward us, its eyes glowing in the dark. I thought for a second it was going to charge. But just as quickly, the bear turned and, with a final swipe at the tent, backed away. It was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. We all stood there, breathing heavily, staring into the dark where the bear had been just moments before. The silence that followed was deafening. None of us spoke at first. We couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. I looked over at Tom's tent. He was shaking too, pale and wide-eyed, but he was alive. He was okay. We all rushed over to him, pulling open the flap of his tent. He was sitting there, his eyes wild with fear. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have the words to answer him. I just stared at him for a moment, my chest still tight, my body still buzzing with the shock of what had just happened. It wasn't until the panic started to fade that I realized how lucky we were. If that bear had wanted to, it could have torn through Tom's tent in seconds. If we hadn't been able to make enough noise, who knows what might have happened. In the end, we did what we should have done from the start. We hung all our food and scented items high in the trees, far away from our tents. And we stayed awake the rest of the night, on edge, listening to every crack of a branch, every rustle in the forest. We didn't talk much after that, each of us lost in our thoughts, still trying to process the close call. That morning, we packed up camp early, with a new respect for the wilderness. We'd come to the mountains for adventure, for the thrill of the outdoors. But that night, we learned the hard way just how serious the risks could be. As we walked away from the site, heading deeper into the forest, we made a pact. From then on, we'd never forget the bear bag. I never considered myself a brave person. I'm not someone who seeks out danger or adventure. Not really. I'm a pretty normal guy with a desk job, a small apartment, and a few hobbies I try to keep up with on weekends. One of those hobbies, more recently, has been hiking. Nothing crazy, No multi-day treks through the mountains, no winter camping, no cliffside scrambling. Just simple day hikes, usually alone, through state parks within an hour or two of where I live. A chance to get some exercise, breathe some fresh air, and clear my head. That's all I ever wanted it to be. I had only been hiking for a few months when this happened. I was still getting used to packing the right amount of water, checking maps before heading out, and understanding the basics of trail markings. I was cautious. I read articles about safety. I stayed on marked trails. I never went out if the weather looked dicey. And I always told someone where I was going and when I expected to be back. The park that day was one I'd visited maybe twice before. Middleton Ridge State Park. Nothing too large, but the trail system wove through about 3,000 acres of forest and small hills, mostly deciduous trees with some thick underbrush in spots. It was early fall and the air had that cool, dry crispness to it. Leaves were just starting to turn, and you could smell the decay beginning in the damp places. The kind of weather that makes you feel alive. I got there around 9 in the morning, signed in at the trailhead kiosk, and took a photo of the trail map with my phone. I chose the Pine Hollow Loop, a 5-mile trail that passed by a small creek and had a couple of lookout points along the way. I packed light, a single water bottle, some granola, a first aid kit, and a windbreaker stuffed in my little day pack. I didn't bring trekking poles, which I sometimes regretted on the steeper trails, but today I figured I'd be fine. For the first mile or so, it was perfect. The trail was clear, a little damp in spots from rain earlier that week, but nothing bad. Birds chirped, the occasional squirrel darted across the path, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze was peaceful. I passed a couple of hikers early on, an older man with a camera, and then a pair of women jogging uphill. After that, it was quiet. It was around mile 2, maybe a little more, that things started to feel different. The trail narrowed a bit and wound through a more shaded area where the canopy was thicker. The underbrush on both sides grew up higher, almost shoulder height in some places, and the path became less obvious. I checked my phone, but I had no signal anymore. Not that I expected to. I often lost signal deep in these parks. That's why I told people where I was going. I stopped for a drink and took a few photos of the trees. When I started walking again, I wasn't paying close attention. I remember that clearly because I was looking up, admiring the way the sun was piercing through the leaves. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, something heavy and solid slammed onto my shoulder from above. It was fast and hard and completely unexpected. I stumbled and let out a sound I can't really describe, a sort of panicked grunt. Before I even knew what I was reacting to, I saw it. A snake. A damn snake had fallen out of the tree and hit me squarely on the neck and shoulder. It was probably harmless. I mean, it didn't bite me, but it was thick and long, with dark green and brown markings, and the feel of its cold, muscular body sliding down my chest and hitting the ground was enough to trigger a full-on flight response. I bolted. I didn't look back. I didn't care if the snake was chasing me, which it wasn't, obviously. I just ran. Pure adrenaline. My pack bounced hard against my back, and I nearly rolled my ankle once on a route. I think I ran a solid quarter mile before I finally stopped, gasping and doubled over, heart slamming in my chest. I was shaking. I wiped sweat off my face and looked around. Everything was unfamiliar. I realized then that in my panic, I'd taken a turn somewhere. The trail under my feet didn't look like the one I'd been on before. It was narrower, more overgrown. I turned in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings. No trail markers, no clear signs. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I didn't panic right away. I figured I'd just backtrack until I found the main trail again. I took a deep breath, picked a direction, and started walking. That's when the unease started creeping in. I walked for a long time, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. No trail signs, no other people, no familiar landmarks, just trees and brush and the crunch of my boots on dry leaves. At one point, I passed a pile of old logs covered in moss that looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't be sure. Then I noticed the silence. No birds, no wind, just dead, heavy silence. Even my footfalls seemed muffled. I stopped walking. The forest around me felt dense and close. The air was colder now, and the light had changed. Still daytime, but the shadows were longer and the sky was grayer. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but it felt like the woods were pressing in on me. I took a drink of water and kept moving. I started to feel watched. It's hard to explain, but it was like this tickle on the back of my neck, like something just out of sight was keeping pace with me. I stopped abruptly and turned around, half expecting to see someone there. Nothing, just trees. But the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. At one point, I heard something, a sharp rustle, like something heavy moving quickly through dry leaves off to my right. I froze. I didn't call out or move, just waited. Nothing followed. I slowly started walking again, quieter now, scanning the woods as I went. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again, this time on my left. Closer. My mouth was dry. I wasn't sure if I was being followed or if I was losing it. Either way, I didn't like it. I picked up the pace. I decided to keep walking straight, assuming eventually I'd cross back over a trail. I had to. The park wasn't that big. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself descending into a shallow gully I didn't remember seeing on any map. The trees were thicker here, the ground soft and uneven. It was darker. I stumbled more than once and had to grab tree trunks to stay upright. Every so often I'd hear that rustling again, off to one side or behind me, always far enough away that I couldn't see what caused it. Eventually, I reached a clearing, just a small one, maybe 15 feet across. At its center was what looked like an old fire ring, just blackened stones and ash, long since unused. Around it were bits of old trash, a crushed beer can, a rusted fork, some frayed rope half buried in dirt. I looked around, no sign of a trail. Then I saw something that chilled me more than anything else. A shoe, not mine, not new. A dirty white sneaker, half buried in leaves, the sole worn smooth. I don't know why it hit me so hard. Maybe because it meant someone else had been here, someone else who might not have left. I felt my stomach twist. I backed away from the clearing and turned, determined to keep moving. More rustling, this time behind me, closer than ever. I ran. This time I didn't care about direction. I just ran, up out of the gully, over logs, through thick brush that tore at my arms and legs. I tripped, hit the ground, got up and kept going. My lungs burned, and my legs were on fire, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I broke through a thicket and stumbled onto a trail, a real marked trail. I stopped, gasping, bent double. I looked up and saw a marker nailed to a tree, red triangle. I pulled out my phone and checked the photo I'd taken earlier. Red triangle was the return loop of the trail I'd started on. I was back. I didn't wait. I followed that trail as fast as I could. I didn't hear any more rustling, didn't feel watched, but I also didn't stop to rest. Not until I was back at the trailhead parking lot, where my car sat waiting, the only one left. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there, shaking. I didn't stop shaking until I got home. I never found out what was in those woods. Probably just animals. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. Maybe even another hiker who didn't want to be seen. I don't know, but I've never gone back to Middleton Ridge. I still hike, but only well-marked trails with plenty of people around. I always carry extra water, a paper map, and a whistle. And every time I pass beneath a tree, I glance up, because I never want to feel that weight drop onto me again. Never want to run blind into the woods, straight into something I can't explain. Once was enough.